How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today what we're going to be talking about is my tips for forest bird photography. Over the last couple of years, I've worked in North American forests and down in the jungles of Belize, and I've really become fond of the forest. I've done breeding bird surveys, nesting surveys, migration surveys, point counts, transects, photography, and everything in between. And I think it's one of the most interesting habitats to photograph in. There's one really key benefit to forest photography, and it's that, say for example, you're doing waterfowl photography or you're doing birds in flight, usually you're restricting yourself to the early mornings and the late afternoons to get that nice light. But when it comes to forest photography, the trees and leaves act as a bit of a diffuser, and it creates kind of a dappled light effect. And you can photograph in the middle of the day during harsh sunlight if you have the right forest. And that's one of the main benefits of forest bird photography, is that it extends your hours that you're able to get great shots. So what I'll do personally is I'll stay more towards the outside and open areas in the early morning and late afternoons. And then when the light gets a little bit harsher, I'll travel more into the forest and try to get some forest birds. I've broken this video up into 3 different sections. The first one is tips before actually heading out to do forest bird photography. Second is tips while you're out in the field doing forest bird photography. And lastly, I'm going to share a few tips that I use on days that are really slow. And when it comes to forest bird photography, it does happen every so often where you do have a bit of a slower day. So I'm going to share that with you guys, and let's get into it with the first section, before heading out. I don't know if you guys can see on the camera my sweet biologist tan. Nice short sleeve shirt here, and then down the neck right here. Nice contrast. My first tip before heading out is I like to choose my days and my locations very specifically. If I'm after a certain bird that prefers a certain type of forest, I'm going to try to target those type of forests, obviously, but also I choose the day very specifically. Not only for the weather, what I'm talking about is actually people. If you have a park that there's a lot of people throughout the entire week, that might be beneficial just because the birds are more used to people and you can get closer. They're more familiar with having, people running through, people on bikes, photographers, whatever, and you might be able to get closer to your subject. For me personally, I don't like parks with a lot of people, even if it has the opportunity to get me closer to animals and better photos and stuff like that. It just seems like I'm a little bit more disconnected from the actual process of taking these photos. So for myself, I rather go to the areas that I have more chance of encountering a bear than I do a person. My second tip before heading out is to check a bird app, so either Merlin or you can go online and use eBird and just see what birds are in your area. And that's very important because what I've noticed in the past is when I look through a bird list before actually going out, I tend to be more likely to encounter those birds that I've been looking at. And if you're thinking about that bird in the back of your head, you're subconsciously looking for areas that it might be. It's just a psychological thing. It's kind of like when you learn a new word and then you see that word everywhere. It's the exact same thing. You're just putting that bird in the back of your mind. So before heading out, check a bird app just to see what birds are in your area, and that'll give you a better chance to capture some great images. My third tip is one that I'm guilty of a lot of times, but I'm trying to force myself to do it a little bit more, and that's before you leave your car. Ideally, once you leave your house, actually, just change and check your settings on your camera. To kind of adjust them for the settings that you're going to need when you get out of your car. Because once you get out of your car, it's fair game. Anything can happen. This actually happened to me last week. I got to a wetland, I parked, and I even told myself, I was like, I should check my settings, make sure everything's okay. And then I was like, I'll just do it when I get to the actual wetland because I'll see what the conditions are and everything. And as I'm walking there, I finally get there, put my bag down. As I'm reaching into my bag, an osprey flies right by, and I wasn't ready. And I ended up getting one shot as he was flying off. Settings were off, he was taking off in the other direction, so for me it's a missed opportunity. If I was just there maybe a couple seconds before, or if I had my camera handy, I would have been able to get some beautiful shots of him flying by, and he was really close. Like the one I'm showing you right now is full frame, so he was extremely close, and that's just a missed opportunity. And it happens to me regularly, where you get out of the car and then right as you get out of the car in the parking lot there's a bird. So I like to now adjust my settings before I leave the house, and I'll have my camera sitting with me in the passenger seat because I can just pick it up, and on your way there sometimes you can pull off on the side of the road if you see a raptor or anything like that. So yeah, prepare your camera before you get out of the car, and ideally before you leave the house, just to make sure you don't have any funky settings. My fourth and final tip for before heading out is have your binoculars handy. Kind of similar to your camera, always have your binoculars on you. I think my binoculars have become probably one of my most important tools that I use for bird photography. You might be wondering, why are binoculars so important for bird photography? And when I first started out, I was using my camera and my lens as my binoculars. And if you've ever tried to do that, it's really frustrating. It's much harder to acquire focus. And sometimes I'm not trying to take a photo, I just want to see what the bird is. And what you're doing is you're essentially holding up your arms and you're wasting precious hand-holding energy to hold your camera up just to see what this bird is. So what I'll do is I'll have my binoculars with me whenever I'm trying to scout or whenever I'm just trying to identify what a bird is. I'll use my binoculars. It takes way less energy. You do it much quicker than trying to find it with a telephoto lens. And what I've noticed too is when I'm able to identify a bird, I can better prepare for that bird. So if I'm walking down a trail and I see a black and white warbler down the road, I know that black and white warblers are gonna creep up and down trees, creep up and down branches, and then fly to the next tree and just continue doing that. So if I see a black and white warbler and I see him moving in my direction, I can better position myself and prepare myself for getting that photo. So I think binoculars are a must-have if you're a bird photographer. Now we're getting into some of my tips that I use for forest bird photography. And I'm going to talk about settings, but forest bird photography is a bit of a generalization because it doesn't really explain what type of forest you're in. So an aspen forest is going to let in a lot more light than a thick coniferous forest, and the difference between the two are huge in terms of settings that you're going to use. So I'm going to be generalizing these settings. You may have to adjust a couple things depending the forest you're in, but overall this is what I use for most of the forests that I go in. So first off, I'll be using the Sony 200 to 600mm for my forest bird photography, and what I'll do is I'll open up the aperture all the way to 6.3 and I'll keep it at that. I usually don't ever change that when I'm in the forest. And next I'll go to my ISO and I'll set my ISO to auto, but I'll bracket it, so I don't want it to go below or above a certain point. And what I'll usually do for most forests is about 800 to 1000 as the base, and then as the high around 6400. That seems to work pretty well for most situations. You might be wondering, well, why don't you go all the way down in terms of ISO to say like 100 or 200? And the reason I don't like doing that is because say you're photographing birds lower down, like on the ground or at mid-level of the canopy, and their backgrounds are other trees, other shrubs, or just the ground as the background. The auto ISO is going to work very well. But say for example you're photographing a bird against the sky that's higher up in the canopy, what might end up happening is, depending your metering mode, it might actually adjust for the sky. So what would happen is, if I have my ISO at 200, it might think, wow, this is a really bright scene, and it might bump down my ISO to 200, and then the bird itself is going to be completely dark. So what I find is limiting the minimum to around 800 to 1000, it definitely reduces the chances of that happening. And what that allows me to do too is that all I have to worry about is my shutter speed. So everything else is kind of working for me. I know my aperture is set to 6.3. I know my ISO is auto and it's bracketed. So all I have to do when I find a bird is maybe adjust the shutter speed. And I find for a forest setting, it just works the best. There's so many changing conditions and changing light that you don't want to have to think about 3 different settings to keep changing. I find focusing on one is probably the best way to go. If you're wondering about metering modes, the one I use for my Sony is the center. Center will evaluate the whole scene, but put a little bit more emphasis on the center of the image. And I like that. I think for forest bird photography, that's perfect. So depending your camera, go online, check what all the metering modes do. But yeah, for Sony cameras, I will usually use the center, and that seems to work fine for me in most of my settings. If you aren't aware, what metering modes will affect is it's your exposure level down at the bottom of your display when you're taking a photo. So there's 0 right in the center, which is supposed to be a well-exposed image, and then you can either go overexposed or underexposed depending on the image that you're taking. For myself personally, what I expose for is the bird all the time. So if I'm photographing something higher up in the canopy, I don't mind having those blown out highlights. I actually find it's a really cool effect. Personally, I like it. I think it's artistic. I think it kind of makes it look a little bit more surreal, and it just adds a certain effect, and it kind of gives you the sense that you're in the forest when you see a photo like that. There's also some people who think that one overexposed pixel is one too many, and they'll try their best not to overexpose the image. So you can always, in those situations, expose for your background, so your sky, and then in post you can always raise your shadows and hopefully bring in more light to your bird and get a proper exposure. My second tip is probably the tip that has increased my bird photography the most when it comes to forest birds, and that's the bird along ecotones. And if you don't know what ecotones are, it's the area where 2 different ecosystems overlap. So that area where they overlap, that's an ecotone. And in these ecotones, what ends up happening is something that ecologists and biologists call the edge effect. And what the edge effect states is that In these areas where two ecosystems overlap, that's where you'll have the greatest diversity of life. And it makes so much sense because in these areas where two ecosystems meet, that's the area where birds and wildlife can have access to both resources from both ecosystems. So a great example of this is a nice field or a nice grassland meeting the edge of a forest. So in that area, that's where you can have the highest diversity. And in those areas, another thing that happens that's great, so let's go back to our forest and grassland example. If you're moving through the forest, there's only a certain amount of light, and then once you get to that forest edge and you hit that grassland, that's where all the light is starting to come in, and that's where you get the highest plant diversity. And plant diversity equals insect diversity, which equals bird diversity, which equals predator diversity. So those areas are extremely important for birds and wildlife, and it's the area where you're going to get the most chance of getting great photos. Go along those areas. Don't just truck into the forest. I used to do that when I first started birding. I knew nothing. I was just trekking kilometers and kilometers into the forest and trying to find these birds, but what ends up happening is that you only find a couple really select forest specialists that live that deep. These ecotones will also create these microclimates and microhabitats that you can actually find some very specialized birds in those small areas. One thing you can do, go back on your old photos, the ones you really like, and try to see where you took them. I did this with my photos and I realized that most of these were along edges of two different habitats or very close by. So if you're going between a forest and a river, or you're going between a primary succession forest and a secondary succession forest, you'll probably be getting more opportunities to photograph different species of birds. So try to focus more along these ecotones. If you do any other type of photography too, not just birds, if you do macro like snakes and small mammals and butterflies, those areas are great too. So focus on the ecotones and don't worry as much unless you're targeting a certain species to go deep into the forest. My third tip while out in the field is be very strategic with where you're actually stopping to take breaks. If you need to take a call, answer a text, you want to stop to rest a bit, be strategic. Don't just stop in one place. What I've started doing is instead of just if I'm thirsty or whatnot and I want to stop, I won't just stop. I'll actually walk until I find an interesting area. Interesting areas could be a number of different things. One is if the light is coming through the forest really nicely in a certain area. That's an interesting area to stop in. Another good area to stop is if you see some really nice perches, like if there's some moss hanging off of it or some vines, stuff like that. And a third good place to stop is if you have fruiting shrubs or fruiting trees. Stopping in those areas, there's not a guarantee that a bird is actually going to come through, but if it does, you're going to be ready and you're going to get a great shot. Tip number 4 has to do with birding on a trail. So most of these forests have trail systems running through them. And where do you position yourself when you find a bird along a trail? So I've experimented with this quite a few times. Say for example, you're birding down a trail and you see there's a bird on the right and he's hanging around in the trees. Do you put yourself on the left side of the trail or the right side of the trail? What I've noticed is putting yourself on the left side of the trail is bad for 2 reasons. One, it increases your angle to the bird and you're more easily seen from the bird. And 2, what you're doing is if the bird's in the branches, the background is most likely going to be other branches or other trees, and it might be a little bit too close and you might get some distracting backgrounds. But if you put yourself on the right side of the trail, you can use those right trees as a shield so the bird can't see you as well. And what you can also do is when that bird comes out to a snag or a branch, its background is all the way down the trail, so it's basically infinity, and you'll get these nice smooth backgrounds, and it increases your chances of better photos and being more camouflaged from the bird. So when you're birding along a trail, try to stick to the side that the bird is actually on and use some of those trees as a little bit of a blind to get you to photograph those birds a little bit more easily. Let's talk about slow birding days. One thing that I like to do is called follow the chickadees. Here in Eastern Canada, a lot of the mixed flocks that I encounter are usually composed of different warblers and flycatchers, but one species that's usually always there is the black-capped chickadee. So what I'll do is I'll listen for a chickadee and I'll look for a chickadee, and if I find one, I'll follow that chickadee and hang around in that area. Not all the time, but sometimes other birds will be behind it and it'll follow through. Or another thing you can do is find that chickadee and see what direction he's moving in and kind of walk in the same direction. Usually other birds will pop up. They seem to like chickadees. They do nice alarm calls and they're very vocal. So I've found most of my mixed flock warblers with black-capped chickadees. It might be a little bit different in your area. You might not have chickadees in your area, but find a common bird. Sometimes just find any bird and hang around in that area, and hopefully something comes through and changes your luck. Tip number 2 is I'll increase my walking pace, so I'll cover more ground, but more importantly is I'll make a little bit more noise. And sometimes when you're skulking around and you're walking very slowly, birds won't fly off, birds won't show themselves because 1, they might not see you or hear you, and 2, they might just think you're a predator and they might hunker down. But when you're walking at a quicker pace, a faster pace, making maybe a little bit more noise. Sometimes birds are going to fly up to a perch and analyze and try to identify, are you a predator, are you not? So sometimes you can get these really cool head poses and body poses from birds kind of looking at you inquisitively. That's one of my tips, is walk a little bit faster. Like I said, you can also cover more ground and hopefully get to some different areas that have more birds. But on slower days, you just got to try different things and hopefully something good happens. Third thing I want to talk about is pishing and call playback. So if you don't know what pishing is, it's just making a pishing noise with your mouth to draw a bird out from the forest or draw a bird out from a bush. So you'll go like psh, 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 psh. Sometimes smaller songbirds are very interested in that, and they'll pop up and they'll kind of look around and try to find you. So a lot of people use pishing to get birds to come out of the bushes and get a better photo of them. And call playback is just playing a song, playing a call on your phone, and hoping a bird is going to respond. Is call playback okay? I guess it depends on the situation. Personally, I wouldn't just go into a forest and say, you know, I want to see a black-throated blue warbler and then play the song and hope that one pops up. I think if you see one and it's not during the nesting or mating season, it's probably okay to do it to a limited extent. But another thing you need to think of is you might be in this moment seeing a black-throated blue warbler and playing the song, but then somebody else down the trail might not see it but hear the song and then put that into their bird list, and it kind of affects data a little bit. Quite honestly, I try to limit myself. I've been doing less and less of it since I first started birding, pretty much because I don't really care. Like, I'm not upset if I don't get a shot. I'm not upset if a bird's not coming out of a bush. I don't care if I get the shot. I'm just happy to be out, and if I see the bird, I see the bird. If I don't, I don't. There's other days I don't need to put a bird in distress or anything like that to get it to pop up so I can get a nice photo. Limit it, stay out of the nesting and mating season, and you should be okay. And just think of others, think of the species that you're trying to call out. Is it safe? I hope these tips have been helpful for you guys. If you have any other suggestions, I'm sure there's a ton more. Post them down in the comments below. What do you do for forest birding, forest bird photography? Do you use flash? Do you use any other accessories? Tripods are great too, actually. I didn't mention tripods, but you can use a tripod to get down to those lower shutter speeds. It's very beneficial. The only thing is you have to lug it around, but kind of a good trade-off if you're able to go to like 1/100th of a second or something and get a sharp photo. So let me know in the comments, what do you use, what do you do, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Happy birding.